Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is part 2 of our story. If you like this what if story and want to see part 1, let me know in the comments below. Before we start, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with your friends. Also, check the description for more great content and my playlist. This story was posted by Splemply on Wattpad. Now let's start. Broccoli Bunny's absence. Numerous tragedies involving murders, accidents related to drug overdoses, and the heartbreaking suicides of those who felt utterly lost. Many believed he had abandoned them or worse, lost their last glimmers of hope. Broccoli Bunny questioned whether he had truly caused so much damage. The very sleepy caterpillar reassured him, stating that it wasn't his fault and that he should blame the League of Villains for attacking UA and the 𝐻𝐻𝐻𝐿 for injuring him. 𝐒𝐮𝐦𝐦𝐚𝐫𝐲 echoed this sentiment, encouraging him not to dwell on it. Broccoli Bunny, however, felt differently. He lamented that if he hadn't thrown himself into a fight he should never have been involved in, he could have continued his patrols. He regretted attending a school filled with heroes while being undercover, believing it had led to the current chaos. The very sleepy caterpillar reminded him that without that experience, he would still be living in an abandoned apartment, isolated and without support. Broccoli Bunny retorted that he had been fine for years and didn't need anyone's help. 𝐒𝐮𝐦𝐦𝐚𝐫𝐲 urged him to calm down, pointing out that living alone in such dire conditions was not something anyone should endure. Broccoli Bunny insisted that the current situation was worse than anything he had faced before. He had noticed the streets were eerily empty during his patrol the previous night and had even encountered Shigaraki and the Black Mist villain. He revealed that the 𝐻𝐻𝐻𝐿 from USJ had multiple quirks, with police reports indicating DNA from at least 4 different individuals within that one body. He speculated on the implications of needing multiple people to create a single 𝐻𝐻𝐻𝐿 and what that might mean for future tests. The group reacted with horror at the thought, realizing the potential threat posed by an army of even more powerful versions of the 𝐻𝐻𝐻𝐿. Ratatouille expressed concern that the entire country could be in danger, while Broccoli Bunny suggested the threat extended beyond Japan. Ratatouille noted that without evidence, he couldn't arrange an official meeting with the police or the Hero Public Safety Commission. The very sleepy caterpillar suggested leaving an anonymous tip, but Ratatouille explained that the commission might dismiss it as a prank due to the gravity of the situation. 𝐒𝐮𝐦𝐦𝐚𝐫𝐲 asked if all they needed was evidence, to which Ratatouille confirmed that even a small amount would be invaluable. Just then, the very sleepy caterpillar mentioned he was on his way to UA, prompting 𝐒𝐮𝐦𝐦𝐚𝐫𝐲 to question the unusual silence in the house. The very sleepy caterpillar explained that he had chastised Broccoli Bunny and checked for injuries before securing him to his bed and leaving for work. 𝐒𝐮𝐦𝐦𝐚𝐫𝐲 was puzzled by how Broccoli Bunny was able to type in the group chat. The very sleepy caterpillar's frustration with 𝐻𝐻𝐻𝐿 was palpable, as he threatened to hold him accountable if anything happened to Broccoli Bunny after reading the messages. 𝐒𝐮𝐦𝐦𝐚𝐫𝐲 suggested 𝐻𝐻𝐻𝐿 should consider leaving the country for his safety. Ratatouille and 𝐒𝐮𝐻𝐻𝐿 expressed their concern for Broccoli Bunny's emotional state, recognizing that the news of so many deaths could lead him to make regrettable decisions. The very sleepy caterpillar informed them he was searching for Broccoli Bunny and would not be at work. Ratatouille asked Yamada to check Broccoli Bunny's bedroom, and 𝐒𝐮𝐦𝐦𝐚𝐫𝐲 confirmed that his phone was on the nightstand, but his vigilante costume was missing. The group realized he was gone. Days passed without any sign of Broccoli Bunny, despite the efforts of pro-heroes from UA searching his territory and the surrounding area. The very sleepy caterpillar finally reported that he had found Broccoli Bunny sleeping in a cardboard box in an alley. He was on his way to UA to have him checked by Recovery Girl. 𝐒𝐮𝐻𝐻𝐿 urged him to hurry, as they had no idea what Broccoli Bunny had endured during his absence. The very sleepy caterpillar reported that Broccoli Bunny had a large cut on his thigh, bandaged with a blood-stained piece of fabric, along with several other cuts and bruises. He noted that Broccoli Bunny seemed to have lost a lot of blood and was cold with a high fever. 𝐒𝐮𝐻𝐻𝐿 warned that one of his cuts might be infected and emphasized the importance of swift action. The very sleepy caterpillar acknowledged this and hurried to UA. A few hours later, Broccoli Bunny woke up in a place that was definitely not where he had fallen asleep. His mind immediately went into panic mode, and he found himself on the floor, tangled in bedsheets. His flailing was noisy, prompting Shota to rush into the room and quickly come to his side. He asked if everything was all right, suppressing a chuckle but unable to hide his grin. In response, the boy let out a muffled sound, his lower face and body tightly wrapped in solid white blankets. If Shota took a few photos before helping his adoptive son, only he, and perhaps the entire UA staff chat, and possibly the student one if he was really in a good mood, would know. Once the green-haired child was freed from his soft prison, he shot a glare at his guardian and attempted to snatch the phone from his hand. Shota only chuckled and dodged, causing Izuku to trip over the pile of blankets and sheets still on the floor, getting himself tangled up for the second time that morning. At least, Izuku thought it was morning. There were no clocks, and the curtains were drawn over the window. Shota crouched down next to him, ruffled his hair, and picked him up in a gentle manner before placing him back on the bed. As they chuckled quietly, they noticed a certain chimera in the doorway. Principal 𝐒𝐮𝐦𝐦𝐚𝐫𝐲 grinned, commenting on the heartwarming interaction. Izuku startled once again and jumped, with Shota being the only reason he didn't fall off the bed this time. The two exclaimed the principal's name simultaneously, one startled and the other carefully cold. 𝐒𝐮𝐦𝐴 walked further into the room, followed by Recovery Girl, until they were both by Izuku's bed. As Recovery Girl began checking Izuku's injuries and temperature, 𝐒𝐮𝐴 spoke in his peculiar voice that sounded like someone translating mouse squeaks. He greeted Izuku, who instinctively straightened his back and thought carefully about his words. He returned the greeting, just loud enough to be heard, and then asked where his Vigilante costume was. Izuku pulled at the neckline of his hospital gown, hoping he hadn't spent years assembling the perfect items only for them to be confiscated. He considered the possibility of stealing them back when no one was looking, but he would rather not resort to that. He felt unwell. The chimera's grin remained unchanged as he tilted his head. It appeared there had been a minor incident involving a red jumper, various tools, and one of the furnaces in the support department. Izuku was upset about his costume being ruined. He had spent a long time gathering all the pieces for it. 𝐒𝐮𝐴 spoke reassuringly, mentioning that he had assigned Power Loader to design and create a new, sturdier, and better-equipped costume for him. Izuku was encouraged to make suggestions and work on it himself. However, Shota warned him that he was no longer allowed to engage in vigilante work alone. They would patrol together to prevent any further mishaps. Izuku grumbled in agreement, feeling dissatisfied but recognizing it was likely the best arrangement for now. Although he appreciated having backup, he knew Shota was slower than him, and he didn't want anyone else to get hurt because he couldn't arrive in time. Shota also mentioned that there would be consequences for his actions. Izuku was taken aback, feeling a mix of surprise and frustration. Recovery Girl chimed in, supporting Shota's stance. Izuku looked at her, feeling hurt that she was siding with Shota. She reminded him that his disappearance had worried the entire staff at UA. She gently tapped him with her cane, showing a softer approach since he was smaller and thinner than her other students. She emphasized that he was no longer alone and that many people cared about his physical and mental well-being. Shota ruffled his hair, silently asking for his attention, and Izuku turned to face him. Shota reassured him that it wouldn't be too bad. He just needed help with something and believed Izuku would be useful. Izuku understood that feeling well. He had been told since he was 4 that he was useless, so being needed and valuable was something he cherished. It was a craving to be more than just someone who couldn't do anything right. He chose not to complain as 2 of the 3 adults departed, leaving Shota to express his concerns about Izuku's earlier actions. Eventually, Shota settled down in a sleeping bag he had seemingly produced from nowhere, resting on the floor next to the bed. Izuku was sent home 2 days later, fortunately without being confined to a wheelchair. It had taken a lot of pleading and promises to Recovery Girl just to be allowed to leave. She could be quite intimidating when she wanted to be, and Izuku couldn't think of anyone who could stand up to her, not even 𝐒𝐮𝐴. It felt like a miracle to have his casts removed for good. He returned to school on Wednesday, just over a week before the sports festival, and did his best to avoid interacting with others. However, that plan was quickly disrupted when Shota entered his classroom just as math class began. Leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed, Shota regarded Izuku with a serious expression that made the boy acutely aware of his classmates' confused stares. Izuku swallowed hard. He stuttered out a question, asking what Shota needed. Without missing a beat, Shota informed him that he was coming along. Izuku cast a hopeful glance toward ectoplasm for assistance, but the hero remained silent, knowing better than to risk Shota's displeasure. Even though Shota appeared to be in a good mood, that only heightened Izuku's internal panic. Shota turned and walked out of the classroom with a bounce in his step, prompting Izuku to follow without needing to be asked twice. As he trotted to keep pace, Shota's smile widened with each step, making Izuku feel like a prisoner awaiting his fate. The absence of passing students or teachers only intensified his unease. Eventually, they stopped outside the 1A classroom, and Shota masked his grin with his usual bored expression. He clapped his hands once and declared it was time for Izuku's punishment. Before Izuku could finish his protest, Shota flung the door open, placed a hand on Izuku's back, and gently nudged him into the classroom before locking the door behind him. The chatter that had filled the room moments ago fell silent as all eyes turned to Izuku. He hated being the center of attention, and his immediate reaction was to bang on the door and call out to Shota. Unfortunately, Shota simply instructed him to introduce himself, expressing his relief at being able to take a nap instead of teaching. Izuku focused on the students, biting his lip as he took in their expressions, confusion, excitement, and wide-eyed curiosity, but no anger or recognition. To his relief, the explosive blonde he had dreaded meeting was nowhere in sight. Taking a deep breath, he prepared to introduce himself, realizing the class likely had no prior explanation for his presence. He stammered a greeting, introducing himself as Aizawa Izuku and expressing his pleasure at meeting them. The class responded with even more confusion. Ashido nearly shouted his last name, while Uraraka questioned if he had previously introduced himself as Teo. Her expression was a mix of bewilderment and curiosity as she looked around for answers. Kaminari exclaimed in disbelief, questioning how Aizawa-sensei could have a son. The classroom erupted into a chorus of confusion, with students directing their questions at one another rather than Izuku. Overwhelmed, he covered his ears, tears threatening to spill over. He could handle physical pain and anger directed at him, but shouting was something he struggled to cope with. It reminded him too much of his mother and his previous classmates before he switched to online courses. His sensitive hearing, a result of his vigilantism, made it even harder. After a minute, he heard the door unlocking, and Shota rushed in, quickly making his way to Izuku. With a fierce glare, he silenced the class, and then he picked Izuku up. Although Izuku generally disliked being picked up, he felt safe in Shota's arms. Shota carried him outside the classroom and leaned against the wall, supporting him firmly. Shota spoke softly, asking if Izuku was all right. He gently pulled Izuku's hands away from his ears and tilted his chin up to meet his gaze. Izuku nodded, using the backs of his hands to wipe his eyes. He stammered out that he really didn't like yelling. Shota's expression shifted as he realized the implications of Izuku's words. He quietly asked if Izuku's mother had ever abused him, and Izuku's gaze dropped to the floor, confirming Shota's fears. They both stiffened, and Shota looked ready to unleash his anger on anyone who had caused Izuku pain. While Izuku's mother had abandoned him after his father's death, it had taken weeks before she truly let him go. Not all of Izuku's scars were from his vigilante work. Shota pulled Izuku into a comforting hug before setting him down. After fussing over him for a moment, they returned to the classroom, which was now silent enough to hear a pin drop. Shota held Izuku's hand as they stood at the front, taking a deep breath and pinching the bridge of his nose before letting out a sigh. He expressed his disbelief at the situation, his voice low but filled with a palpable anger that made Izuku shudder. The students shrank back, wide-eyed, as they sensed the intensity of Shota's emotions. A few students were trembling nervously, and Izuku could sense that someone needed a change of clothes, possibly more than one. Shota looked up, his glare sharp, on the verge of using his quirk. He expressed his disappointment, questioning why none of them had thought to be quiet around his son. The disappointment in his voice was palpable, and a few students lowered their heads in shame, unable to meet his gaze. As Shota left the classroom with Izuku, he suppressed a scoff. He offered a brief apology for the chaos, and Izuku, still focused on his shoes, replied that it was fine. The walk back to Izuku's classroom was quiet, save for Shota's soft goodbye as they parted ways. Izuku felt a pang of sympathy for whatever consequences awaited Shota's students. The atmosphere in the chat was tense as the students reflected on the morning's events. They expressed their regret over making Izuku cry, acknowledging that they had been too loud and chaotic. The realization that they had upset Aizawa's son weighed heavily on them, and they all felt a mix of guilt and anxiety about facing Shota again. Aizawa, who had been observing the chat, reminded them of the importance of being considerate, especially towards someone as sensitive as his son. He made it clear that their behavior was unacceptable, and that they needed to do better in the future. The students collectively promised to improve, hoping for a chance to make amends. As the conversation continued, they welcomed a new participant, who introduced himself warmly. The students were taken aback by his charm and cuteness, which lightened the mood. They exchanged apologies and reassurances, and the atmosphere shifted from one of dread to one of camaraderie, as they all looked forward to getting to know Izuku better without any misunderstandings. The chat ended on a hopeful note, with everyone determined to create a more supportive environment for each other and for Izuku. Izuku was filled with excitement as he prepared for the sports festival, having spent weeks getting ready for this moment. He felt ready to face any challenge 𝐒𝐻𝐸 might present, though he wasn't entirely sure if he wanted to win or not. He decided he would figure that out as the day progressed. Standing next to Takara amidst a sea of students in the stadium, Izuku watched as Midnight took the stage. Her presence elicited gasps from several students, as she was known for her bold persona. She announced that a student would be chosen to deliver a welcome speech, a role typically reserved for the top performer of the hero course entrance exam. Izuku felt a wave of relief wash over him for not pursuing the hero course, avoiding the pressure of being in the spotlight. As the chosen student stepped up, they boldly proclaimed their intention to win. Izuku cringed at the response, as boos and jeers erupted from the audience and fellow students. Kaken, with his usual demeanor, simply stared with a bored expression and gave a thumbs down, which only fueled the crowd's reaction. To most, Kaken appeared arrogant and cocky, embodying the type of student that staff and peers often found difficult. However, Izuku understood the underlying tension. Kaken was cornering himself. After hopping off the stage, Kaken joined his classmates, seemingly unfazed, while Midnight worked to regain the crowd's attention and continue the festival. She swiftly announced the first round, an obstacle race. Her description made it sound straightforward, emphasizing that anything was allowed as long as participants stayed on course and avoided serious injury. Yet, Izuku had no doubt that 𝐒𝐻𝐸 had designed the challenge to be more complex than it appeared. With the ground rules established, Midnight directed the first years toward a large gate at the side of the stadium. Izuku's class gathered near 1A, and he caught Todoroki muttering something about the first sifting under his breath, hinting at the challenges that lay ahead. 3 lights atop the gate flashed red one at a time until the last one lit up, and they all turned green as Zashi shouted from the booth he shared with Shota. A chill swept over everyone's feet and legs as Todoroki exhaled, causing Izuku to leap just in time to avoid a thick layer of ice that coated the ground, freezing most of the participants in place. The bicolored boy glided past with the grace of someone seasoned in skating, leaving everyone behind. Izuku grinned with delight, following Todoroki's lead while sticking close to the shadowed edges to avoid drawing attention. Soon, the first group of students reached the first obstacle, affectionately named Robo Inferno by Hisashi. It consisted of a multitude of robots from the hero course practical portion of the entrance exam, but this time, no points were awarded for destroying them, they were meant to be avoided. Izuku, however, didn't pay much attention to the rules. Naturally, he reached behind him to grab his bright yellow backpack, quickly pulling out a special gun that fired bullets with EMP effects. Staying close to the wall, Izuku fired 5 shots at the robots that ventured too close, neutralizing each one. They were likely damaged beyond repair, but he figured he could handle the consequences later. Suddenly, an ear-splitting crash echoed, followed by panicked shouts. Izuku dashed toward the sound, hoping no one was hurt, only to find that Todoroki had frozen the colossal zero-pointer robots while they were off balance, trapping 2 students beneath them. Izuku began to question Todoroki's judgment, realizing that it was nearly impossible for anyone to have survived that, and it seemed intentional. Just as panic threatened to overwhelm him, he heard the sounds of stone and steel colliding. Kirishima burst from the wreckage of the robots, exclaiming that if it had been anyone else, someone could have been in serious trouble. His calm demeanor was striking, especially given the danger he had just escaped. Hizashi provided an excited commentary on Kirishima's feat. However, the commotion didn't end there. Tetsu emerged from another robot, echoing Kirishima's sentiments with the same calmness, despite the peril he had faced. Izuku stared in disbelief, his left eye twitching. Todoroki, the son of Japan's #2 hero, had nearly harmed 2 fellow students, and yet everyone around him continued with the course as if nothing had happened. Izuku wondered if the pro-heroes shared the same nonchalance as the students of UA, and how none of them had faced dire consequences yet. Izuku considered continuing on, indifferent to the risks since he had navigated numerous life-threatening situations before. Most of the teenagers around him had never encountered a villain and had never felt the weight of danger. It was baffling that they could carry on without a second thought. Eventually, Izuku decided it was better for his mental state to follow the others' lead. He retreated to the safety of the course's edge and shadows. After a careful search, he found what he was looking for, a massive hand that curled just enough for a child to wriggle through to the other side. Fortunately, that was exactly what he needed. Removing his backpack, he clutched it to his chest to avoid snagging it as he navigated through the small tunnel created by the hand. It was a tight fit, but he managed to squeeze through. When he finally emerged into the warm sunlight, he stumbled slightly, landing in a sitting position while hugging his backpack. One of the other students paused nearby, momentarily captivated by Izuku's adorable appearance. Izuku almost scoffed, thinking that teenagers were all the same. Quickly getting to his feet, he slung his backpack over his shoulder and took off in a sprint. He would have preferred to run faster, but he kept his pace slightly slower than the speedier students. As he dashed past a large piece of metal likely from one of the destroyed robots, he made a split-second decision to grab it. It was heavy, but Izuku adjusted his speed to maintain his momentum. Before long, he arrived at the next obstacle, a massive chasm that looked as if it had been clawed from the earth, with jagged stone pillars dotting the dark void below. As he approached, he noted 2 things. It was nearly impossible to see the bottom, and falling would surely result in disqualification. Earlier, he might have believed there was something to protect the students from harm, but after witnessing Kirishima and Tetsu's close calls, he decided not to dwell on that thought. Instead, Izuku focused on the chasm. Thin ropes connected each of the island-like pillars, likely intended to slow participants down. He carefully observed the students in front of him to weigh his options. Todoroki had just cleared the second obstacle and was moving on, with Kaken not far behind, using his explosions to propel himself across. Ida, Hatsum, and a few others were still less than halfway through. About 8 students remained in the race. Izuku could afford to take his time. He pulled the sheet of metal over his back and backpack, tying the remaining cables around his waist and chest. He bent down and began climbing on all 4s like Tsu had, but halfway through he switched tactics and hung upside down from the ropes as he moved. By the time he reached the other side, his arms felt like jelly. The chasm was over 1/2 kilometer wide, and the ropes didn't go in a straight line, meaning he had probably climbed nearly a full kilometer. His usual style involved leaping across buildings or running, so his arms were built for fighting, not climbing. Nevertheless, Izuku pressed on. The final obstacle was a minefield. Hizashi had announced over the speakers that the mines weren't real and wouldn't cause much damage, but Izuku wasn't entirely convinced. He was short and thinner than most, despite having some muscle. He muttered a few curses under his breath, knowing Nizu was likely listening. The principal had probably anticipated this challenge, and Izuku realized that he had just been given more tools for his strategy. An almost manic grin spread across his face as he took the borrowed piece of metal and used it as a shovel, carefully digging up the mines and using his EMP bullets to temporarily disable them. He attracted many curious stares from passers-by, but he chose to ignore them. After gathering several mines and stowing them in his backpack, Izuku discarded the metal and continued on. By the time he navigated through the minefield, Todoroki, Kaken, and many others had finished, leaving Izuku to come in 36th place. He may have lingered a bit to stay under Kaken's radar, but the other students were none the wiser. Izuku feigned being out of breath, hunching over and resting his palms on his knees to sell the act. Fortunately, no one paid much attention to him, and the obstacle race soon concluded. Midnight called out the names of the 40 who had passed, her grin indicating a positive outcome. Izuku stood up, following the smaller crowd of students as they flocked to Midnight. Only the top 40 had advanced to the next round, while the rest were either taken to the infirmary or directed to their seats to observe the remainder of the festival. Midnight wasted no time announcing the second round of the festival, a cavalry battle. Each team would consist of 2 to 4 members, with one person on top acting as the rider while their teammates acted as the horse. Headbands would be distributed to each team, with points assigned based on their performance in the first round. The goal was to collect as many points as possible by snatching headbands from other teams while protecting their own. After 10 minutes, the top 4 teams would advance to the third round. Midnight then informed the students they had 15 minutes to find teammates and devise a plan. Izuku surveyed the 39 other participants and made a decision. He would be the rider as he was too short to be a horse. He wanted teammates he trusted, but that was a limited pool. Ultimately, he formed a team with himself on top, Uraraka from Class 1A in front, and Hatsum and Takara in the back. Once his team was assembled and had a plan, Izuku looked around at the other teams. Ashido, Shiro, Kirishima, and Kaken were a team, with Kaken on top, Kirishima in front, and Shiro and Ashido in the back. Todoroki, Kaminari, Tokoyami, and Ida formed another team, with Todoroki as the rider, Ida in front, and the other 2 in the back. The third team featured Shinso from General Studies on top, Nairenjiki from Class 1B and Ojiro in the back, and Yaoyorozu in front. Ojiro and Nairenjiki stood still, suggesting some form of control was at play. Another team consisted of Tetsu, Shiozaki, Kendo, and Minoma, with Tetsu and Shiozaki in the back, and Minoma and Kendo arguing over who would be the rider. The last team that caught Izuku's attention was Shoji's. The teen had created several arms that wove together over his back, indicating there were 1 or more people inside. It was a clever tactic, making it harder to grab their headband while potentially making it easier to snatch others. Izuku was pulled from his thoughts by a loud signal over the speakers, indicating the start of the second round. He was ready for the challenge ahead. Izuku immediately directed his team toward Todoroki's. Uraraka had lightened their clothes and equipment, but they still moved slower than the other teams. This was because, while every team was aiming for the 1 million points, most had forgotten to protect their own headbands. Izuku guided his team, weaving through students and discreetly snatching headbands as they went. Having 3 support students with various gadgets and inventions, along with someone who could lighten their load, proved to be a strong combination as they steadily collected more points. Izuku secretly took joy in watching the expressions of others as they realized their headbands were missing moments after he added them to his own pile. He kept a careful eye on the positions and actions of specific teams. For instance, he always made sure to stay as far away from Kaken's team as possible. He knew he would eventually have to interact with the explosive blonde, but he preferred to wait. He wanted to either enjoy the moment or try his best not to reveal his identity. There had to be plenty of 11-year-olds named Izuku out there, and he hoped to convince Kaken that he was just some random person who happened to have green hair and eyes, diamond freckles, no quirk, and an obsession with quirk analysis. As Izuku's pile of headbands grew, another team noticed and subtly changed course to try to steal a few for themselves. It happened to be Shoji's team, known for being particularly troublesome. Stealing their headband would be nearly impossible, so Izuku needed a plan to incapacitate them without breaking any rules. Luckily, he had just the idea in mind. He discreetly pulled a cold metal object from his pocket, dropping it on the floor without his teammates noticing. Shoji's team continued to follow, foolishly believing they had the element of surprise. Eventually, Shoji's foot bumped against the black metal, triggering a small explosion that covered him in glue. The sticky substance hardened instantly, trapping him and preventing him from using his arms. Meanwhile, Izuku, Hatsum, Takara, and Uraraka were several meters away, making it hard to pinpoint who had set the trap. Only Majima-sensei, Shota, and Hizashi would know it was him, as Majima-sensei supplied the materials, and the latter two had seen him build similar devices. After that, Izuku decided to set 2 or 3 more glue traps around, just for fun, especially in Kaken's direction. He grinned when he later heard a trap go off, followed by familiar cursing and explosions. His teammates were confused, but Takara, who was in the same class as Izuku, understood the meaning behind his grin and felt sympathy for whoever had drawn his ire. The cavalry battle continued without interruption from the referee or commentators, the timer dragging on as it approached its end. Team Izuku kept stealing headbands from unsuspecting victims, clawing their way up the leaderboard until they settled comfortably into second place. After a few more minutes, Izuku steered his team into a corner and covered all 4 members with what could only be described as an invisibility cloak, eagerly watching the drama unfold. Uraraka had accidentally left snacks and desserts in her pockets from before the festival started, so everyone had something to munch on as they enjoyed the rising panic of other teams. Shoji was still stuck, but his teammates, Azui and Mineta, were finally freed from their human prison. Shinso appeared to be having fun. Now that Izuku had time to observe his quirk in action, he realized it was some type of auditory-based brainwashing ability. Shinso would say something, another person would respond, get brainwashed, and eventually snap out of it after some physical contact. It was a pretty nifty quirk. Yaoyorozu looked a bit guilty, likely because she felt that what she and Shinso were doing was unfair. But Kaken? Oh, Kaken was the best. Their headband was stolen by Monoma's team, and Monoma was teasing and annoying Kaken. Judging by the glare Kaken sent him, which reminded Izuku too much of his bullying, it would be nothing short of a miracle if Monoma made it to the 3rd round unscathed. Kaken barely managed to grab a fistful of Monoma's headbands while using some moves that were almost cheating when the timer ran out. Izuku was incredibly happy to witness Kaken face-planting on the ground, but only his teammates had the opportunity to know because of the invisibility cloak. Thankfully, none of them took that opportunity. All teams disassembled, heading to the center of the arena. A stage had been set up in the middle with Midnight standing on it, a hand on her hip as students gathered around. Izuku stayed on the opposite side of the crowd from Kaken. Midnight called out, instantly silencing any murmured words of good sportsmanship among the students. She congratulated the 4 teams that made it to the end, and cheers erupted from students and heroes alike. First up is Team Todoroki. In second is Team Aizawa. Third is Team Bakugo, and fourth is Team Shinso. The cheers grew louder, filling the air so much that Izuku had to cover his ears. Quiet, quiet. Midnight continued, not angry but a little frustrated. The last round is individual battles between the top 4 teams. All participants. She was cut off by a small voice in the gathering of students. I would like to forfeit, Ojiro said, looking down at his feet. Midnight gave him a confused and sad look, silently asking him to elaborate. I can't remember anything during the cavalry battle except for a few moments at the end. I feel like I haven't earned my place in the 3rd round. A quiet murmur quickly replaced the silence, with people wondering why someone would give up a spot where so many pros could see their individual talent. Me too. Another voice joined in, Nairenjiki, if Izuku remembered correctly. For the same reasons, he quickly added, followed by a nod from Midnight. Okay. Midnight restarted. Since there are now 2 available spots, I would like the team that came in 5th, Team Monoma, to nominate 2 people to continue. After about a minute of discussion among Monoma's team, Tetsu and Shiozaki were nominated to move on. It might have been obvious that Monoma wasn't included in that decision, but that was probably for the best. All students were then given 3 options. They could participate in some recreational games, return to their seats with some food, or find a quiet place to calm down if they were preparing for the 3rd round. Izuku, feeling indifferent about those choices, decided to check on Shota and Hizashi. He was certain he wouldn't regret that decision later. Izuku glanced up at the massive TV hanging above the crowd of onlookers, searching for his first match. Everyone dispersed to pursue their own plans. Izuku hesitated to join the recreational games, not wanting to risk being spotted by Kaken, but he also didn't feel the need to relax. It might have been better for his opponent's sanity if he did, but that was just a possibility. As Izuku made his way through the cafeteria, he noticed a group of girls talking to Mineta and Kaminari. He didn't think much of it until Mineta pointed toward another group of girls in cheerleader outfits. Connecting the dots, he decided to intervene before anything unfortunate occurred. Mineta was finishing up a statement about someone wanting the girls to wear those outfits when Izuku approached. Startled, both Mineta and Kaminari turned to face him, and Mineta fidgeted nervously, avoiding eye contact. It was surprising that Izuku was taller than him, despite Mineta being 4 years older. He asked who wanted them to wear what, and Yaoyorozu explained that Aizawa-sensei supposedly wanted them in cheerleader outfits. Izuku's jaw dropped at the thought. There was no way Shota would ever ask his students to wear something so revealing. He firmly replied that he lived with Shota and had never heard him say anything like that. Shota would want them to wear something comfortable, not that. Ashido, hands on her hips, looked annoyed at the two boys. Kaminari, panicking, insisted that they would all get in trouble if they didn't comply. Izuku sighed and pinched the bridge of his nose. He offered to call Shota, knowing he would be annoyed if interrupted during a nap. The prospect of that made Kaminari and Mineta pale. Mineta quickly suggested they leave, and they hurried off, nearly tripping over themselves. Uraraka thanked Izuku with a bright smile, relieved they hadn't believed the boys. Azui mused about how embarrassing it could have been. Izuku reassured them, suggesting they could call him Izuku to avoid confusion. A few girls nodded in agreement before they all went their separate ways. Continuing on his journey, Izuku paused when Lunch Rush approached him with biscuits. He had a sweet tooth, after all. After a few minutes, he finally reached the commentator's box, where Hizashi and Shota were observing students participating in a scavenger hunt. Neither noticed Izuku as he entered, and he decided to keep it that way for a little longer. He crept toward the bright window, his footsteps silent. Just a few steps away, Shota stirred slightly, prompting Hizashi to perk up. Izuku could imagine the grin on Hizashi's face without needing to see it. Crouching down, he jumped as high as he could, fingers gripping the rafters above. Hizashi turned around and leaped at the spot where Izuku had just been, unaware of his presence. Seizing the opportunity, Izuku dropped down, landing awkwardly on Hizashi's back before sliding off. Hizashi chuckled at the sight, lifting Izuku by the back of his uniform with an exaggerated grunt, as if he weighed more than a basket of laundry. Hizashi held Izuku close, their faces just inches apart, grinning widely. Izuku smiled sheepishly, knowing he had been caught. He could easily escape, but he decided it would be more fun to play along. Hizashi teased that Izuku was trying to sneak up on him. Izuku feigned innocence, batting his eyelashes while still held up. Hizashi snorted, almost dropping him, and Izuku rolled his eyes at the comment about his weight. As Hizashi laughed quietly, Shota mumbled for them to keep it down, trying to rest. However, Izuku noticed a small smirk beneath Shota's bandages. Deep down, Shota was pleased that Izuku felt comfortable enough to joke around. Izuku was surprised he had allowed Hizashi to pick him up instead of running away. It was progress, but he would never let them know his thoughts on the matter. Hizashi seized the moment to tease Shota further, asking if he could let them have some fun. Izuku joined in, making puppy eyes while holding back giggles. Shota sighed, leaning back in his seat, unable to hide his amusement. Hizashi chuckled as he walked over to his seat, carefully placing Izuku on the floor beside him. He considered putting the boy in his lap but thought better of it. Izuku crossed his legs and looked up at the two men with a mischievous glint in his eyes. He asked if Hizashi really needed sleep, knowing full well the answer. Hizashi's laughter filled the air, and despite himself, Izuku couldn't help but smile. He enjoyed making people laugh, even if it meant annoying Shota. Shota sighed, clearly exasperated, and decided to change the subject to avoid further teasing. He inquired about Izuku's plan for the third round. Izuku's demeanor shifted as he focused on Shota, pondering his response while thoughtfully stroking his chin. He explained that he didn't want to reveal his strategy just yet. It would be more entertaining if his opponents were caught off guard. He mentioned using his skills as a support corps student but admitted he didn't plan on winning. Shota looked down at him, his expression unreadable, while Hisashi raised an eyebrow in surprise. Hisashi questioned why Izuku wouldn't want to win after all the hard work he had put in. Izuku responded that he didn't seek recognition or attention, especially since his alias as Oleander could be at risk. He was determined to avoid any unnecessary risks. Hisashi frowned, not entirely satisfied with the answer but choosing to support Izuku's decision. He encouraged the boy to give it his best effort, expressing disappointment at the thought of his skills going to waste. He ruffled Izuku's green curls, eliciting a grumble from the boy. Shota chimed in, acknowledging Izuku's exceptional abilities while agreeing with his longing to avoid unwanted attention. He emphasized the importance of keeping his outings discreet, especially with internships on the horizon. Izuku nodded, taking Shota's advice to heart. As the clock indicated that the third round was about to begin, Shota reminded Izuku that he had a group of students to face. Izuku grinned and jumped up, excitement radiating from him as he rushed toward the door. Although his match wouldn't start until later, he was eager to watch the other matches up close. Hisashi chuckled at Izuku's swift departure, shaking his head as he called out a wish of good luck to the boy. Izuku dashed through the stadium halls, determined not to miss the first match. However, as he rounded a corner, he collided with what he thought was a wall. To his surprise, it was the number 2 hero, Endeavor. Normally, he would have pulled out his notebook to fanboy, but the situation felt too serious for that, especially with Endeavor glaring down at him. Izuku stood up, forcing a mock apologetic smile as he raised his hands in a placating gesture. He nervously chuckled, trying to play innocent, but was abruptly interrupted by Endeavor, who demanded to know if he was Aizawa Izuku. Izuku paused, a more serious expression crossing his face as he nodded. Endeavor scoffed, crossing his arms as he mentioned that his son had shared stories about Izuku, particularly his actions during the USJ incident. Izuku froze for a moment, processing the information. While he usually wouldn't be bothered by someone mentioning his achievements, it felt unsettling to hear it in this context, especially without his vigilante persona. He wondered why Todoroki had shared that information. Students were expected to keep their caretakers informed about incidents like USJ, but that detail was supposed to be confidential. The reports indicated that All Might had single-handedly saved everyone, stopping the Nomu and assisting the heroes against the villains. Endeavor was the last person Izuku wanted to have that information. He was intelligent enough to eventually figure out the connection between Izuku and Oleander, yet careless enough to disregard the rules regarding the extent of damage one could inflict on a villain or vigilante during capture. When Izuku hesitated to respond, Endeavor raised an eyebrow and continued. He remarked on Izuku's appearance, commenting on how he looked frail and questioning his age, suggesting he looked like he was 8. This made it difficult for Izuku to suppress a scowl. While he could brush off the insults, the implication that he was so young stung a bit. However, he felt even more defensive about Todoroki. Izuku and Todoroki hadn't interacted much, and they were far from being friends, but from what Izuku had observed, Todoroki seemed like a decent person. He might have lacked manners, but he was kind during their brief encounters. Izuku preferred that to excessive chatter, which he reserved for himself. Endeavor's immediate assumption that Izuku was seeking attention didn't sit well with him. That was his son he was talking about. If Todoroki had gone to great lengths to gain his father's attention, it reflected poorly on Endeavor's parenting. Yet, Todoroki didn't strike Izuku as the type to seek attention in that way. Perhaps Endeavor had another child who constantly sought his approval. Izuku didn't know, but it left a sour taste in his mouth. He made a mental note to discuss it with 𝐒𝐻𝐦𝐦𝐚𝐫𝐲 later. Izuku tried to clarify his involvement in the earlier incident, explaining that he had been trapped on a boat with 2 other students who could vouch for him, along with Eraserhead and All Might. Although Endeavor seemed skeptical, he dropped the subject. However, the new topic was hardly better. Endeavor claimed that no matter what Izuku had accomplished, he could never defeat his son, Shoto, who had been created to surpass all might. This statement raised alarms for Izuku. The way Endeavor referred to Todoroki as his, whether intentional or not, was troubling. It felt as though he viewed his son merely as a tool for his ambitions. The word, created, was particularly unsettling. If Endeavor had indeed brought a child into the world solely for that purpose, it raised serious concerns. Izuku recalled some rumors he had heard about Endeavor. He had 4 children, but the eldest was deceased, and his wife was in a mental institution, deemed unable to care for their children. Perhaps Endeavor was the one with issues, responsible for those tragedies. Taking a deep breath, Izuku attempted to calm himself, resisting the urge to lash out. He lacked evidence for his suspicions, but he could bring it up with Nizu and possibly other staff members. He didn't trust Endeavor at all, especially if his assumptions were correct. Izuku assured Endeavor that he would do his best to win. Endeavor rolled his eyes but walked away with a heavy step, his presence imposing. Izuku sighed, feeling a mix of relief and frustration. He began walking toward where his class was seated, mentally preparing to share what he had learned with Nizu. As he walked, Izuku felt his phone buzz. It was unusual for anyone to message him at that moment, as the only people with his number were UA teachers, busy with the sports festival, or Mai, who had said she wouldn't distract him. Assuming it was an emergency, he paused to check his phone. To his surprise, it was not an emergency. A group chat was buzzing with activity. 𝐒𝐮𝐦𝐦𝐸𝐵 messaged him, asking if he was still against placing first. Broccoli Bunny replied, expressing reluctance about the idea. The very sleepy caterpillar warned against whatever 𝐒𝐮𝐴𝐵 was about to suggest. 𝐒𝐮𝐴𝐵 urged Izuku to consider going for gold, reminding him of his unique position in UA history. Despite his reservations, Izuku agreed to consider it. The conversation continued with encouragement and playful banter, with the very sleepy caterpillar expressing confidence in Izuku's abilities and urging him to do his best against the competition. Izuku felt a surge of determination. He would give it his all. What have I done? Everything, Broccoli Bunny thought. The very sleepy caterpillar agreed, stating they would hold him to that promise. 𝐒𝐮𝐴𝐵 acknowledged the fairness of the situation. Broccoli Bunny then pointed out that 𝐒𝐮𝐴𝐵 and the very sleepy caterpillar should be commentating. 𝐒𝐮𝐴𝐵 responded by suggesting that Broccoli Bunny should be with his classmates, watching potential future opponents instead of chatting on his phone with 2 older guys. Number 47 chimed in, confirming 𝐒𝐮𝐴𝐵's point. Broccoli Bunny asked what number 47 was doing there, to which number 47 replied that he had nothing better to do than talk. He encouraged Broccoli Bunny to go out and fight some kids. With determination, Broccoli Bunny agreed and logged off. Izuku pocketed his phone, a small smile on his lips. He hadn't expected such a reaction from Shota, but considering the man's past with cats, he should have anticipated it. As he sat down next to Kara, he realized he had missed the first round and that the second was nearing its end. He glanced up, mentally noting the new scores. He watched as Ida and Hatsumi entered the platform that Cementos had created, their names and classes announced by Hisashi over the loudspeaker. Izuku quickly took out his notebook, ready to jot down notes. He felt uncertain about whom to root for. Ida seemed a bit intimidating yet earnest and strict. Their interactions had been limited to the USJ incident and text messages, leaving Izuku unsure of how to feel about him. On the other hand, he had known Hatsumi since the beginning of the year and had interacted with her many times. Despite her chaotic and extroverted nature, he preferred her over Ida. If he had known Ida better, he might have felt differently, but as an introvert, his preferences were clear. With that in mind, he cheered for Hatsumi while writing. He noticed her playfully toying with Ida to showcase her inventions, which he found amusing. He planned to do something similar later, though he intended to progress further rather than forfeit. Wait, was she actually forfeiting? Izuku understood that she didn't intend to win, which made sense. Calling her out on it would have been hypocritical. Still, he wanted to see her succeed. After a few minutes, 2 more students entered the arena. Izuku began to question the idea of having students fight for entertainment. The society that UA represented had once been his dream, but witnessing it now made him reconsider. For a brief moment, He imagined them battling adult criminals but quickly dismissed the thought, realizing it was far worse than Nizu's plans. Perhaps he should leave such matters to the principal. Kaminari and Shiizaki's fight was brief. Shiizaki had confronted Hisashi about labeling her an assassin and offered a quick prayer. Kaminari, attempting to flirt while boasting, launched an attack that failed spectacularly. Shiizaki easily immobilized him with her vines, ending the round in mere moments. Despite his predicament, Kaminari continued to flirt, leaving Izuku puzzled. He couldn't understand why Kaminari persisted, especially since it seemed unlikely that Shiizaki would ever be interested in him, given his behavior and the differences in their beliefs. Izuku observed as the medic robots carefully placed Kaminari on a stretcher, wheeling him away to Recovery Girl. Shiizaki walked away, a hint of guilt evident on her face. It was likely she felt remorse for her actions. The next match was between Kirishima and Tetsu, both from different classes of the hero course. Izuku decided to divert his attention from that battle. He recognized the opportunity to take notes on these two powerful individuals who were likely to become strong heroes and might eventually face him during the school year. However, he chose not to engage in that task. Earlier in the festival, he had experienced a wave of panic when he witnessed the two being overwhelmed by a massive robot in the first round. The image of them being crushed had haunted him, and he didn't want to relive that moment. He already knew the outcome of the match. The two were evenly matched, making a tie the only possible result. As he had anticipated, both Kirishima and Tetsu ended up knocked out simultaneously, collapsing onto the concrete. Medical bots quickly arrived to carry them away on stretchers. It was not a pleasant sight to see two 15-year-olds unconscious and injured. Izuku felt a strong urge to leave, but he couldn't, as the next fight was going to be Takara's. Takara was not afraid to admit that she felt a bit nervous. While she had confidence in her abilities as an engineer of support items, she hadn't trained in combat like her opponent had. Ishido had likely spent years honing her quirk, carefully managing acidity levels and usage. Rue had devoted her time to designing tools for others, never expecting to be the one in combat. As she ascended the steps of the concrete platform, watching Ishido's confident smirk, Rei became acutely aware of her surroundings. She noticed the crunch of pebbles under her shoes, the fluttering of banners in the wind, the sounds of the crowd, her short hair blowing across her face, and the feel of fabric and metal against her skin. Yet, her gaze remained fixed on Ishido. Rue recognized she had several advantages in this fight. She had her gear, the ability to quickly analyze her opponent's physical state, a skill she developed while designing support gear, and the fact that Ishido was unaware of her quirk. However, Ishido's lean yet strong frame and the confidence radiating from her made Rue feel as if she would be overpowered quickly. In her mental processing, Rue completely missed the starting signal. Ishido charged at her with surprising speed, forcing Rue to instinctively dodge to the side. She focused on analyzing Ishido's movements, trying to decipher her thought process. When Ishido formed a blob of acid in her hand, panic surged through Rue. She knew Ishido likely wouldn't use anything potent enough to harm her directly but was aware of the potential for human error in unpredictable situations. After dodging several more attacks, Rue realized she needed to calm herself. Getting worked up was counterproductive, and she needed to concentrate fully to utilize her tools effectively. Not only did she want to win, but she also aimed to impress potential sponsors with her capabilities. She began counting her breaths, striving to focus on anything other than the chaos around her. Once she felt sufficiently calm, Rue retrieved a device from a holster on her leg. It resembled a gun but served a completely different purpose. Instead of firing bullets, it was designed to neutralize certain elements within a specific radius. Though Rue was unsure of the exact composition of Ishido's acid, she suspected it contained fluorine. She hadn't expected to face Ishido but had packed the device as a last-minute decision. She was grateful for that choice. As Ishido approached again, Rue pulled the trigger, causing Ishido's acid to dissolve and drop harmlessly to the ground. Without its key component, the chemical balance of Ishido's acid faltered, causing it to lose its funk. A small, shaky smile crept onto Rue's face as she observed Ishido's confusion, igniting a newfound sense of confidence within her. With Ishido's quirk neutralized, Rui saw more opportunities to utilize her gadgets and possibly even her own quirk. With her plan in mind, she put the gun away without turning it off, intending to pull out a different support item suited for her quirk to impress potential sponsors with her design skills. However, Ishido slipped on the puddle of goop that used to be her acid, hitting her head against the concrete just out of bounds. There were a few cheers from the crowd who didn't realize there was an injury, but most people fell silent. Rui went completely still, not moving a muscle or even breathing. She had won, but it was by default. She hadn't been able to showcase her abilities effectively and had possibly injured another student. The victory felt undeserved, and she believed she could have done so much better. An opportunity had slipped through her fingers, and she felt she had disappointed her teachers, friends, and any curious sponsors who might have been interested in her. Her entire plan had crumbled. The weight of her mistake was overwhelming. She didn't notice Cementos and Midnight calling out to her, or present Mike over the speakers. All she could do was stare at Ishido's motionless body, feeling the crushing burden of her actions. Had she accidentally caused serious harm? Would she face consequences? Would the school expel her for endangering a fellow student? Was everything she had worked for in her life now meaningless? Rui clutched the fabric of her shirt over her heart, her breathing quickening. Her mind raced with thoughts, and all the sounds and sensations around her blended into an incomprehensible chaos. The only thing she could focus on was Ishido's blurry form on the ground, warm tears stinging her eyes and streaming down her face. She couldn't articulate her feelings, but all she wanted was to sink into the ground and disappear. After what felt like hours, something blocked her view of the pink girl, warm hands cupping her cheeks. She took a moment to let everything settle, looking into Izuku's face. She hadn't even noticed him jump down from the seats to come to her, but she was immensely grateful he was there. Seeing the concern etched into his expression, his large emerald eyes meeting her icy blue ones, made her feel a mix of guilt and relief. She wrapped her arms around him and buried her face in his shoulder, seeking refuge from everything around her. Midnight's hand rested on her shoulder, but her focus remained on her friend in front of her. He whispered calming words, and although she couldn't make out the specifics, she appreciated his effort. He gently coaxed her to follow him out of the arena, leading her to a quiet room where they could be alone. She followed without question, trying to calm herself enough to process the events that had just unfolded. She knew she might have overreacted, making others doubt her capabilities and potentially entering the next round with a tarnished reputation. Yet, with Izuku guiding her by the hand, she found that she didn't care as much as she usually would. Izuku wasn't particularly pleased when he was told he couldn't stay with Takara in Recovery Girl's temporary station. He understood the reasoning. There were already plenty of people there, some students with injuries and others with heatstroke or minor injuries from more intense fights like the one between Todoroki and Zero. He had to accept the situation and leave, hoping to avoid another encounter with the woman's cane. Before he departed, he noticed something. It was small and brief, but Takara appeared much calmer than before. He had expected her to need more time to settle her mind, though he knew she still had thoughts to process. However, she seemed somewhat fine. Her body was relaxed, and a small, content smile graced her face. Izuku didn't know the reason behind her expression, but it was certainly better than her feeling distressed. By the time Izuku reached the room he was meant to stay in until his round began, he heard a quiet buzz from his phone. It was probably unwise to have it in his pocket during a fight, so he decided to check his messages before he had to leave it behind. There was one message, but it was from a while ago. Izuku wondered how he had missed it at the time. Just a bunch of idiots responding to Ratatouille. Bunny, we have a problem concerning Oleander matters. Broccoli Bunny, what's the problem? Ratatouille, someone spreading information. Ratatouille, also, not to sound accusatory, what kept you from responding earlier? Broccoli Bunny, what kind of information? And, sorry, I got distracted. Ratatouille, apparently, someone learned of your existence and is sharing that knowledge online. I haven't determined exactly who, but their account doesn't seem too concerning. The very sleepy caterpillar. I wouldn't worry about it too much. Whenever anyone discovers there's a new vigilante, they always share it. The same thing happened to a couple of them like Knuckle Duster and Michi before they became more well-known. Broccoli Bunny. I heard about them, and they don't seem to be in too bad a situation. Ratatouille. Well, they both ended up spending more time on the field, and neither of them were students. It will be much harder for you to balance vigilante work and your life since you'll be more recognizable to civilians, heroes, villains, and police alike. There are pictures of you too. They were blurry but recognizable. Broccoli Bunny thought about continuing as normal while being more mindful of the fluctuations in criminal activity in his area and his behavior around civilians and victims. He didn't aspire to be popular, like Popstep, but he also didn't want his reputation to suffer because of others disapproving of his work ethic. It would be different but not too hard. The very sleepy caterpillar believed that Broccoli Bunny would manage it somehow. Ratatouille agreed, noting that the next round was starting soon and didn't want to distract him further, especially since he had already found a decent solution. Ratatouille wished him good luck. Izuku set his phone down on the table, ensuring he had all his supplies ready for his round against Kaken. He knew the round would start soon due to 𝐒𝐻𝐦𝐦𝐚𝐫𝐲, but there were no screens in the room to watch the fight. Something about 𝐒𝐻𝐦𝐦𝐚𝐫𝐲's words was concerning, particularly the reference to his vigilante name being spread around. The use of green puzzled him. Was it a reference to his last name? Had 𝐒𝐻𝐦𝐦𝐚𝐫𝐲 uncovered something? If so, Izuku felt conflicted. It meant one less person to hide from, and knowing 𝐒𝐻𝐦𝐦𝐚𝐫𝐲, he would likely use this information to help Izuku grow. However, there was the concern that 𝐒𝐻𝐻𝐦𝐴 didn't fully understand human emotions. If he decided to be supportive, he might keep what he learned to himself, but if he thought sharing it with other pros would aid Izuku's learning, he wouldn't hesitate to do so. There was also the possibility that 𝐒𝐻𝐻𝐦𝐴 was trying to connect better with the teachers and had chosen a pet name based on Izuku's noticeable coloring. Still, with 𝐒𝐻𝐻𝐦𝐴, one could never be sure. Eventually, Present Mic's voice broke through his thoughts, announcing that Shinso had won his fight against Uraraka. This meant Izuku and Kaken were up next in just a few minutes. Izuku felt a mix of emotions. Usually, he was excited about the chance to face Kaken again, but as the fight approached, anxiety began to creep. He worried about whether he could actually hold his own against Kaken. Kaken had bullied Izuku in the past, and while it hadn't lasted long, Izuku had vivid memories of burns, bruises, and being told to jump off buildings. No amount of improvement could help if he ended up frozen in fear. For now, he had to push those feelings aside and bury them deep in his mind. Despite this, he felt a thrill at the prospect of standing up to his bully, causing chaos and confusion. With no suppressed feelings at all, he was ready. Izuku eventually got up and left the prep room, heading to the arena entrance. He could almost picture Kaken's face when he realized he was up against a small gremlin of chaos and destruction. When Hisashi finally called the two combatants into the arena, Izuku put on a grin, which was easy when he saw Kaken's expression of confusion. It was understandable. Who wouldn't be confused facing an 11-year-old who had seemingly vanished years ago? Izuku's amusement grew as they stepped onto the concrete, and Kaken's confusion shifted to irritation and anger. In Kaken's mind, he was furious. Not only was that little runt here, but he felt tricked. He had expected to face the son of his admittedly intimidating sensei, but instead he was left to fight a twig. He thought he could easily overpower the kid, but he knew the teachers would intervene if he dragged the fight out. He hadn't forgotten about the USJ incident, and there was no way he would lose to a twerp. Sooner than expected, Hisashi started the round, and both boys reacted instantly. Kaken charged toward Izuku, who was already dodging an explosion and pulling something from his pocket. That something turned out to be a glitter bomb. Kaken took a step back, glitter covering him and getting in his eyes. It was annoying, but he could manage, and he swung his fist in Izuku's direction while he recovered. Izuku dodged easily, a hint of a smile on his lips as he swung back and connected with Kaken's stomach. Kaken stumbled but quickly opened his eyes, now red and irritated from the glitter, and glared at Izuku. He held out his palm, unleashing a flurry of explosions near Izuku's head. Izuku instinctively jumped away, the tips of his hair singeing. He needed a haircut anyway. He patted down his hair before continuing the fight, avoiding serious injury while dragging it out enough to impress the watching pros. They exchanged blows, punch for kick and explosion for glitter, glue, and other harmless distractions that slowed Kakin down. Izuku balanced everything carefully, aware that anyone could be watching, allowing himself to be knocked around a little. By the time he decided to end the fight quickly, he had a busted lip, possibly torn ligaments in his knee, and a few bruises, while Kakin had irritated eyes from the glitter, a twisted ankle from trying to escape the glue too forcefully, his own share of bruises, and sore arms from his quirk. Just as Izuku grabbed Kakin's arm to throw him out of bounds, his attention was suddenly pulled away by the unexpected silence. The crowd was quiet, with only a few murmurs, and Hisashi and Shota had stopped commentating. Instead, all attention was on the large screens that hung around the stadium, now filled with static. When the static cleared, Izuku's breath hitched. The screens displayed a side-by-side comparison of the fight he had just had with Kakin and the encounter he faced in the isolated alleyway with Kurogyari and Shigaraki. Sometimes, it highlighted specific moves and habits, while other times, it simply allowed the audience to pick up on the similarities themselves. Izuku stood there, still clutching Kakin's arm and staring ahead blankly. Nobody else moved or spoke, and even Kakin himself seemed unusually calm for the moment. Izuku was certain Nizu was already addressing the issue, but it was too late. Every hero and student in the stadium, along with any parent, civilian, hero, or villain watching the live broadcast, would see this. Internally, he berated himself. He shouldn't have gone out that night while still recovering from exhaustion and healing, and he definitely shouldn't have pursued two A-rank villains on his own in that state. It became clear after a while that they were merely toying with him. It took around 2 minutes for the broadcast to be taken down, and Midnight and Cementos quickly ushered the boys out of the arena, away from prying eyes. Nizu announced over all 3 stadiums for the different year groups that the sports festival was going to be cut short and that everyone was to return home or back to patrol. Izuku walked quietly, his wide eyes fixed on the floor, gently pushed forward by Midnight's cold hand between his shoulder blades. Usually, this wouldn't have been such a big deal. So what if a handful of people figured out their barista was a vigilante? Most of them probably wouldn't act on it, and it wasn't hard for Izuku to evade the police and curious eyes. A simple haircut, dye, change of wardrobe, and a few faked documents were enough. However, now it was an entirely different problem. Now he was a hero student, and all of Japan knew it. The media would not be pleased with a vigilante slipping through Nizu and the hero's watchful eyes, and they, along with the Hero Commission, would force Nizu into a difficult decision: either keep a vigilante in his school and face the consequences of public scrutiny or send him to the police. Honestly, Izuku was just trying to suppress the panic and wasn't focused on much else. He didn't want the school's name to be tarnished because of him, but he also wasn't keen on the idea of prison. Izuku's attention snapped up to Shota, who looked at him with concern. He didn't know how to respond. Should he cry? Brush it off? Find a solution? Force his growing anxiety down? Before he could decide, Shota stood in front of him and spoke softly, asking if he wanted to go home for now. Izuku nodded silently, looking back down at his bright red shoes as Hisashi took his hand and guided him through the halls. Grateful for the silence as they walked, Izuku noticed Hisashi steering them away from people as much as possible, and the 2 adults avoided asking questions. Izuku appreciated this. He didn't even know how he felt yet and certainly didn't have the capacity to explain his jumble of emotions to others. The older men seemed to understand that. The drive home was quiet and uneventful. It was still early afternoon, but Izuku decided to head to bed and try to take a nap, and Hisashi and Shota allowed him to do so. He could sort everything out later. For now, he just needed to let everything settle first. Then, he could start to consider functioning again. Izuku didn't sleep. He was never really able to sleep during the day unless he was completely exhausted, which only frustrated him further. It left him alone with his thoughts for longer. He wasn't sure how to process the situation. He hadn't thought for long, but he knew the best and worst outcomes. The best would be that the public and police didn't pay much attention to him or even encouraged him, while the worst would involve either imprisonment or the Hero Commission using Nizu's oversight as a reason to remove him and place someone else in charge of UA. There were ways to navigate this, but there would definitely be consequences either way. It was a frustrating predicament, and he didn't know how to address it. There was no way to gauge how much was an overreaction without knowing how others would respond, but by that time, it would be much harder to manage the fallout. He ran his hands down his face with a sigh, curling up under his blankets and covering his head. He needed information and clarity, but he needed to think productively. Forgive him if he struggled with that part. He was tired and stressed. Oh, and he was 11, but that was a minor detail. Eventually deciding that his brain wasn't cooperating enough to do anything useful, he sat up and got out of bed. This wasn't helping him. He didn't know what would, but perhaps Shota or Hizashi had better information than the bare minimum his mind had conjured. Shota watched from the couch as his friend busied himself making drinks in the kitchen. Coffee for Shota and green tea for himself, as usual. Though, Shota doubted coffee would help him much at the moment, as enjoyable as it was. Neither of them had said much since Izuku had gone up to his room. They didn't really know what to say. This wasn't a situation that either Shota or Hizashi were familiar with. While Shota had experienced something similar before, it was never on such a large scale. Oleander had only recently gained some recognition, and though he wasn't as famous as someone like Popstep, word had spread about him online over the past year. He didn't engage in grand gestures or high-profile cases, so while many were aware of his presence, it was more like background knowledge. However, the exposure of a vigilante's identity, especially one who was a student at UA and the child of a teacher, was bound to generate excitement. It was an intriguing story, and Shota understood why people were invested. Yet, he didn't view it as a story, it was a real situation unfolding for his ward, and he felt somewhat powerless. With a soft sigh, he leaned back on the couch as Hizashi approached, carrying 2 mugs. Shota was grateful to have one arm free from its cast, allowing him to pick up his mug and drink, albeit shakily. Hizashi sat down beside him, cradling his own mug silently. The silence was not uncomfortable, but some noise would have been welcome. Fortunately, light footsteps echoed from the staircase. Both men turned to see Izuku descending slowly, eventually settling on the couch next to Shota and leaning against him. There was ample space next to Hizashi, but Shota chose not to move. Although Izuku didn't have favorites, he had known Shota longer and trusted him more. Prolonged contact wasn't typical for Izuku, aside from the occasional playful lift by Hizashi, but Shota felt it was important to maintain their closeness. Shota observed Izuku, who had not changed out of his sports uniform, still speckled with glitter. He appeared unfocused, staring blankly at the wall. While he was better than before, frustration lingered in his expression. Shota carefully set his coffee down and gently placed his arm around Izuku's shoulders. It was a risky move, but the boy didn't pull away, which Shota took as a positive sign. He began speaking quietly, hoping to minimize disruption. He asked if Izuku wanted to discuss what had happened. Izuku nodded slightly, leaning into Shota as he expressed his uncertainty about how to respond to the situation, admitting he hadn't expected it at all. Shota reassured him that there was no reason for suspicion and emphasized that there was no perfect way to respond. They just needed time to think and perhaps consult Nizu or the other teachers. Izuku shook his head, expressing concern about involving Nizu further, given the pressure he was already under from the commission. Shota sighed, realizing he was at a crossroads. He knew that if he and Hizashi weren't careful, Izuku might retreat into isolation again, just as he had done in the past. The thought of Izuku disappearing for days without contact was daunting, especially in such a critical moment. Hizashi chimed in, suggesting that Nizu would likely be willing to help and might even enjoy the challenge. Shota agreed, running his fingers through Izuku's messy hair, trying to provide comfort. They both sensed that Izuku was absorbing their words, which was a small victory. Suddenly, Hizashi stood up with an energetic smile and proposed they take a break from the stress. There was little they could do at that moment, so he suggested a movie night to help them relax. While the idea didn't initially excite Shota or Izuku, it was certainly better than dwelling on their worries. Izuku was encouraged to take a shower while the adults prepared the lounge for their movie night. Shota, still limited by his injury, contributed as best he could. They gathered popcorn, some candy from Hizashi's secret stash, extra pillows and blankets, and drinks to enjoy while watching a hero documentary. Izuku, who had done research on the topics presented, provided insightful commentary throughout the film, adding depth to their viewing experience. They all knew they would feel sore in the morning from sleeping in awkward positions on the couch, but it was worth it. The challenges of the day could wait. After all, the situation couldn't possibly worsen overnight, could it?